All right. I want to share some lessons with you guys from a podcast that I just did because I think it can help you with your communication, especially if you're someone who aspires to communicate about difficult or controversial topics online. For some context, and you can check out the podcast on my profile, it was a rock climbing podcast that I got invited to be on, even though I'm not a rock climber, because the host of the podcast had seen my content. He really appreciated the nuance that I bring into my views and took interest in the journey that I had as someone who voted against Trump twice and now is voting for Trump. And he felt that the rock climbing community is very liberal and it would be useful to expose them to different viewpoints and open up conversations about politics because, like it or not, politics is ubiquitous right now, and I don't think it's going to stop being ubiquitous on November 5th. Before we even did the podcast, he knew that it would probably get a lot of backlash. So he demonstrated a lot of courage by even having me on and opening up this conversation. So I knew that there would be backlash, and there was. There were like over 400 comments. A lot of them, the majority of them, very negative. People threatening to unfollow, unsubscribe, all this stuff. Some of them were just critical of the view, but a lot of them were personal attacks and insults. And yeah, it was very raw, right? Because I've made at this point hundreds of videos, but it's still uncomfortable to have people call me names or make assumptions about my views, make assumptions about my background, make assumptions about my career. And I was also really grateful because I was like, great, now this is an opportunity to practice what I preach even more and share some lessons. So I've written down some of the lessons here on where to improve. And to be clear, I think that overall I did a great job on the podcast. And there's also areas where I think it can be even better, not to avoid backlash, but to be more influential to the people who are ready for the lesson. The first lesson is empathy precedes logic. And the more controversial what you're talking about is, the more that you need empathy. You can't logic someone into a position if they don't feel safe, even considering that position. This was most evident when I talked about abortion on the podcast. So, the logical case that I made is that abortion is not the most important issue in a context where we have to look at the potential for a nuclear World War III, and in my opinion, the American health crisis. And I think there's several existential issues that are more important than abortion. I also challenge people who are single issue voters to reconsider their priorities and ask yourself a question. If we were in World War III right now, would you rather World War III end or have federal abortion rights be granted everywhere like they were under Roe v. Wade? Now, I didn't state that last point as well on the podcast as I did now, but that was essentially the point. And I said I'm pro-choice, but this is just not a priority for me this election. And I stand by that. And I think, especially not having seen the comments, I think what I could have done was just more explicitly acknowledge women and the position that women are in the aftermath of the repeal of Roe v. Wade. Acknowledge that, yeah, there have been some cases like Amber Thurman, who died due to abortion complications and not being able to get the treatment that she needed. Acknowledge that some women just have fear of losing their rights under a Trump presidency. And just bringing more empathy to things, because the way to look at empathy is empathy builds a bridge that logic can cross over. So if you're just giving logical arguments to people, there's no bridge for the logic to cross over. And there can't actually be any change in perspective until the emotions are addressed. And when people feel safe, that's when they actually can change their mind. So that was the first lesson. Empathy precedes logic. You got to always build more empathy before you bring in logical arguments. The second thing was extraordinary claims require an extraordinary amount of explanation. One of the topics I touched on was the Jean Carroll civil suit against Donald Trump. So for those of you who don't have context, there was a woman named Jean Carroll who accused Donald Trump of sexually assaulting her back in the 90s. and she won $5 million for the sexual assault case, and then $82 million for a defamation case, because Trump insulted her, called her crazy, said, I don't even know who this crazy woman is. And then there was an additional massive fine levied against him. Now, if you want context on the whole case, there's a video on my profile about the sexual assault case. But basically, I pointed out in the podcast that, hey, there are some incongruencies in the story that caused me to doubt the credibility of Jean Carroll. And some of those inconsistencies, I'm not going to get into them here. If you want the full story, check it out on my profile. But basically, she couldn't name the day, the month, or the year where the sexual assault happened. She wore a dress on a magazine cover saying, this is the dress that I was wearing when Donald Trump assaulted me. Then people found out that the dress wasn't made in the year that she claimed she was assaulted. Then she revised the year that she was claimed to be assaulted. The whole case was bankrolled by Reid Hoffman, who's one of the biggest Democratic donors. The laws were changed around the time that Trump left office so that the case could even be prosecuted. So a whole bunch of factors. And when I was talking about how that case just felt really not credible and incongruent in the podcast, I kind of just like mentioned it, but kept on going rather than going more deeply into the case. And in hindsight, I realized, oh, well, it's an extraordinary claim to say that the person who's suing a man for sexual assault in a sexual assault case is not credible. And that requires a high standard of explanation, rationale, and evidence. And I didn't really provide that. I kind of mentioned it and then kept on going because I was talking about my overall progression in going from hating Trump to voting for him. So that's the second thing I think I could have done better. And I encourage you all to think about this when you have opportunities to go long form, like you got invited to a podcast or you're making a longer video. When you're making an extraordinary claim like that, take the time to make sure that there's an extraordinary amount of rationale so people can at least understand where you're coming from, even if they disagree. Third thing is, this is really important when you're dealing with backlash online, is recognize that negativity is fast, loud, and public. Positivity is slow, quiet, and private. So some people did have a positive reaction, but many of those people would just like quietly like the post, or they'll send a DM to me or the host. And that's okay. I mean, I totally get it, because if you look at the comment section, I mean, it's crazy. Like, it's like a mob just building up. So understandably, if you're someone who's looking at that post, it becomes scary to actually speak out against a developing mob. And as the person who might be getting commented on, it can be easy to think, oh my God, it's all negative. I did something really bad. But remember, oftentimes the people who are positive or even just neutral are not going to say anything. And they're not going to go out of their way to make a comment. And social media algorithms and incentivize negativity. That's part of why we have the media landscape and polarization that we have right now, because negativity gets clicks, negativity gets engagement. So just keep in mind, if you're afraid of communicating online, if you're talking about something real, there will be negativity, but you don't need to take that sample as representative of the whole. The next lesson is on framing. It's really important that when you're talking about controversial things, you frame first. And I think this was the biggest structural lesson from doing this podcast. Again, the context is I'm jumping on a podcast. They don't know who I am. I'm not a rock climber. It's a rock climbing podcast, and they've never talked about politics explicitly before, or at least not done a full episode on it. And the way that we entered the episode was talking about me winning an Emmy for a career that has nothing to do with what I do right now. So for context, I used to work in the video game industry. I used to produce the League of Legends World Championship, and I won Emmys for that. Is it in here? Yeah, it's right there in the back. Which is cool, but it's not very relevant to a political discussion. And in hindsight, what we should have actually done is introduce why we're even talking about politics on a non-political podcast, who I am, and how my voice is unique and how my journey is unique, and also explain why we're talking about it to begin with, which is to introduce people into other perspectives and open up a conversation that gets people out of the echo chamber that they might have been in. But we didn't do that. And as a result, I think the backlash would have happened no matter what. But I think there's people who, if we had provided proper framing, could have more easily received the perspective and the wisdom in the conversation. So we didn't do that, and that's a lesson for you on when you're talking about something that is very sensitive, framing why you're even talking about it, who you are, and what the goal is very, very important. And then the last thing is just be compassionate for yourself. I it's not my first time dealing with controversy. It's because I've been talking about politics, obviously. It was the first time that I've received this much backlash about something I've said, and there were times where I wondered, "Damn, am I a bad person? Am I some fucked up dude? Did I say something really heinous?" And I had those thoughts looping and looping, and eventually I was like, "All right, I don't want to start spiraling here. How about I just like go listen to the podcast and give myself an honest critique?" So I listened to the podcast, I took notes, and I concluded, I was like, honestly, this was great. And there are things I could have done better. I totally see how someone with different views would find this really provocative. But um, there, there are ways I could have done things better, and I'm also proud of what I said. And it's also very normal when you're talking about topics that require courage to feel tender and feel sensitive and feel raw when people are giving you backlash and giving you heat. And that's okay. Right? Just like be present with that. And at the end of the day, I realized I know where my heart was. I know what my intentions are. Uh, I know that I'm open to feedback. I know that I'm open to considering perspectives, and I got me. And that's the most important thing, because when you're out in the arena, people in the crowd, they don't understand what it's like to be in the arena. So most of the people who are commenting, they've never actually had to speak with their own voice and their own face on camera about something that's controversial, about something that's sensitive, and they don't know what it's like when they say something that's like really hostile towards someone who is in the arena and is speaking and using their voice and speaking their honest beliefs. And you can't expect compassion from the masses, so give it to yourself. So those are the lessons. Um, yeah, it's cool. I mean, I just like to grow. My name is Kaizen, which means continuous evolution or continuous improvement. So even though it's uncomfortable to receive negative backlash, I'm really grateful for the lesson. Gonna keep on going. I wanted to share this with you to inspire you to be courageous and recognize that whatever happens, you can handle it too. Peace.